1776 was a momentous year. There are several documents that were published that year, two of them of which I'm thinking that really had a major impact upon not only America, but also the direction of the Western Hemisphere. One of them, of course, you know of as the Declaration of Independence, but one that it probably has more influence, a more long-lasting impact regards the economy of the world or the economy of the Western nations. And it was published, a work that was published by Adam Smith, who was a Scotsman who published a book called The Wealth of Nations. Adam Smith's basic idea was that we need to have a free market, and everybody is free to operate in this free market. So free market is what gives us the wealth of a particular nation. But the basic premise that Adam Smith worked upon was what he called the invisible hand that works behind the marketplace. And the invisible hand is simply the idea that people are interested in themselves, not in a selfish sense, but the betterment of themselves and their family. And their families themselves that they're trying to better in the marketplace, that actually has an effect upon the marketplace as a whole, upon society as a whole, because it betters everyone else. And that's what he called the invisible hand. The idea is, of course, freedom in the marketplace, that you are free to buy, you're free to sell, you're free to try, you're free to fail. We've left all of those principles many years ago. But nevertheless, he called that the wealth of nations. The idea, of course, latched on into America with freedom in the marketplace, and it has created the greatest marketplace or the wealthiest nation on the face of the globe, America. However, I would like to suggest that there is really a greater wealth than simply the marketplace or freedom in the marketplace in America or anywhere else. And the wealth of nations really is that which gives stability to a nation, and that is the home, the Christian home, a family. And the family is that stabilizing influence in society that gives us moral direction in a nation. And that really is, what I suggest is the wealth of nations, and that is a Christian family, a Christian home. The text is Colossians 3, verses 18 through 21. And before noting that particular text, we might also think about this passage from Genesis chapter 18 and verse 19, where of Abraham of old it was said, God speaking, I have known Abraham that he will command his children and his household after me, that they may do the word of the Lord, to do righteousness and justice, and that I may bring upon Abraham all the promises that I have given him. Note carefully that Abraham is held up, his family is, as a model of what a Christian home ought to be. That is, the father is the head of the home, managing and giving direction to a family, and giving direction specifically to children, that he may command his children and his household after him, that they may keep the word of the Lord, to do righteousness and justice. So Abraham is held up as a great model for a Christian family, and it gives us really the undergirding of what I might call the wealth of a nation. And the wealth of America has been this family, which of course today in modern parlance is called the nuclear family. So let's think about it now from Paul's standpoint in Colossians chapter 3. And they're basically only 4 verses that we're going to notice this morning. We'll notice them 2 by 2. So we'll notice the first 2, and that regards the marriages, where he tells us, first of all, regarding wives and husbands. So he tells us very plainly, beginning verse 18, wives, be in subjection to your husbands as is fitting in the Lord. And then, husbands, love your wives and be not bitter against them. So here's the role that Paul lines out for a husband and a wife in a family or marriage. So let's pick up the wife first of all. He says that the primary idea is, the undergirding principle here is that she is in submission to her husband. That is, there's a subjection that is there. That is reflective of the created order. The created order is in Genesis chapter 2 that when man was by himself, Adam, that God said, it is not good for man to be alone, and I will make a help. And the word is suitable, I think King James English reads help meet, but it means help suitable to a man. The idea is, of course, that she is an auxiliary in the family and the husband is the head of the house. That's exactly how we have it as far as Colossians 3 is lined out. So it reflects the created order, but it also reflects Christ and the church. If you turn back to Ephesians chapter 5 and verse 23, here's parallel instructions given to the Ephesian church by the same apostle as we have in Colossians 3. He tells us that the husband is the head of the wife, as Christ is the head of the church, being himself the Savior of the body. So the home is to reflect Christ and the church, not only to reflect the creation account, but to reflect Christ and the church. That's why Paul tells us in 1 Corinthians chapter 11 and verse 3 that the head of every woman is the man, the head of the man is Christ, and the head of Christ is God. So the order is, by divine sanction, the Father, the Son, the man, and the woman. It is to the detriment of our society that we have left that order and we've skewed the order and ignored what God has set in place for us. And we even know from the satire that is told regarding husbands that are controlled by their wives that instinctively society knows that this is the created order that God has given. But let me stop there and let's look at something else. We'll come back to it in a little bit. That is what I'm about to mention, and that is socialism. Socialism was, first of all, foisted upon our world by Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels in what was called the Communist Manifesto. Karl Marx called himself a scientific socialist. That's what he called it, the communist idea, socialism. That's what it is. So he was a scientific socialist. He called it scientific because he thought he relied upon Charles Darwin and the origin of the species, that man has come out of the rocks and dirt, out of the slime pits of history, and that's how man came about. So that's why he called himself, of course, a scientific socialist. So his partner in that was Friedrich Engels. Engels wrote a book in 1884 called The Origin of the Home. Now get this, the origin of the home, the family, and private property. The origin of the family and private property. And his idea is echoed once again in a textbook that was printed in about 1900 called The Elements of Socialism, and the authors are Spargo and Arner. Engels basically said, and Spargo and Arner reiterated, that here's the socialistic idea. First of all, rejecting the Bible, repudiating the Bible and the creation account entirely. Therefore, man has come about and created the marriage institution himself. So it was Engels' goal to explain how that came about. Spargo and Arner wanted to explain, how did the home come about? If we're going to reject the Bible account of creation, then what explanation are we going to give for the home and for a marriage contract? So the answer is, according to Engels, that in the beginning, men were able to basically breed with anybody they wanted to, and the state was to provide the herders for the children of the offspring that were put out on those unions. So there was not a marriage at all, and so the state provides the care for the children, and a man may able to have, women may able to have as many as they want, but it has nothing to do with ownership. The ownership belongs to the state. Spargo and Arner said exactly the same thing in their book. I read it maybe about a year ago. It's just absolutely one of those landmark books on socialism, and it's absolutely stunning how plain spoken they are about it. That the family came about, and here, well, so where did the family come from? Here's how they say it. Well, since in the beginning, according to Engels, that's how it was we've just described. So how did the family come about? Well, it came about because greedy and wealthy men wanted to keep all the lovely money in their own family or in their own group and their own progeny. So they wanted their children to get it, that is, those offspring of them. So they created the family to keep all that lovely money. That's why the family came about. And we'll come back to some of these things in a little bit. You'll notice that it begins and ends with antagonism to the Bible and a biblical concept, biblical model. Let's look at the next statement regarding what Paul has to say pertaining to husbands. He says that they are to love their wives and be not bitter against them. Here's one of the basic fundamental principles of the Bible. Love is here commanded. You did not fail to see that. And it shows us exactly what Solomon brings us in the book of Proverbs over and over again, that a person who is a mature Christian or a mature godly individual in Old Testament terminology is to manage his or her own feelings. You're to manage your feelings. We talked about that last week regarding anger, and the same thing regarding jealousy. So a person is to manage his own feelings. Whether it be his anger, he's to tamp it down. He's to bury it. Jealousy, bury it. Those are feelings that arise in individuals, and you are in control of yourself. So Solomon would say this in Proverbs 25 and verse 28. He would say that a man without self-control is like a city without walls, that is, open to intrusion any time. And that's exactly the case. If there's no self-control regarding your own feelings on subjects, then you're like a city without walls, that is, subject to invasion by anything that comes along. So what's the point? The point is that love is, we would say it's a feeling, but it also begins with a decision. And it is something that we are to manage. And that's exactly what we have in Ephesians, or rather Colossians chapter 3, as well as Ephesians 5. Husbands, love your wives. And so there is the management of your feelings. That's a command for the husband. And then it has, be not bitter against them, that is, sour. So let's think about an individual that was sour, and the Bible calls him a churlish man. You remember who that was? In 1 Samuel chapter 25. So it is in the period of Saul's kingship. David is now a renegade, that is, Saul has tried to kill David, and David has surrounding him about 600 men, and he's fled from King Saul, who's turned the government into a persecuting power against the good, against people who are doing right, against David. So David has to flee for his life, and a group of men surround him. So David flees to the south country of Judah, and in that south country near the city of Hebron, there's a small village called Maon. In Maon, there is a man who lives, and he's a wealthy individual. He's a sheep herder. He has many lands, flocks, and herds. He's from the line of Caleb, and his name is Nabal. Nabal is described as a surly or churlish individual. Nabal did have one redeeming virtue, however. He had a good woman in his house, and his wife's name was Abigail. She is described as beautiful of countenance and a wise and godly woman. Nabal had all of his sheep herders out, and they were shearing the sheep, herding the sheep, and they had gone to different places. And in these days, when foreign nations would invade the territory, they would take away many of the animals, but David and his small army would protect some of the people in Israel, including Nabal, and he protected him from someone stealing all of his animals. Finally, after David had rendered those services with his armed men, armed guards, he sends 4 of his individuals, his young men, he sends them to Nabal and asks for provisions, which was a perfectly legitimate request. Provisions for he and his army, or some of them, because Nabal was an extremely wealthy man. Watch how the meeting goes. Nabal says, there are many people in this country who are runaway slaves, insinuating that David is a runaway slave. He said, am I going to take my flocks, my herds that I have done with my men on my property and give them to men I don't even know where they're from? He knew all about David, but he was insulting David and sent them back with that message. David was angry. He was ready to go fight. And so his men began to arm themselves, to come in, and they were going to attack Nabal's village. It was actually Nabal had an extended family, and he was going to go and exterminate them. Nabal's wife, Abigail, heard about it. she quickly saddled some donkeys and put many provisions and food stuffs on the donkeys, and she hustled out to David's camp. She came and she bowed down herself before David. David was girding on a sword, ready to go at that point. She bowed herself to him and she said, "Let all the blame be upon me." And she recognized that she said, "Nabal, my husband, is a churlish, a surly man." That is, one who cannot get along with him. Then she also advised David, reminded David, "You have kept yourself from innocent blood all of this time. Remember that vengeance belongs to God." And in her speech, David came to his senses. He recognized that she was right, she was good, she was holy, she was godly, and he blessed her for the fact that she had kept him from shedding innocent blood. Abigail goes home, and when she gets home, Nabal is in a drunken stupor. He has had a big party, he's laying inebriated, and so she doesn't tell him what she's done that night. So the next morning he awakens when he's now slept off his drunk, and she tells him what she has done. He is so enraged that the Bible tells us that his heart became as stone, that is, apparently either a stroke or a heart attack, and he lay immobilized for 10 days. And in the instructive language of the Bible, the Lord took his life. Vengeance belongs to me, I will recompense. Sometimes that means in this life. Abigail saved the day. And as the rest of the story goes, of course, we know that Abigail becomes a wife of David. But here's the lesson, and that is, don't be a churlish, surly, that is a sour individual. Husbands sometimes tend to the sourness, and that's exactly what Paul is warning husbands against. Don't be sour, don't be churlish. So love your wife, be not bitter against them. Now let's turn attention, and before we do, let me mention this one other thing. We have, as I mentioned, the divine order. We have the Father, the Son, then we have the man and the woman. That's the divine order. Even though that is the case, it is not to say anything about the worth of a woman. The woman is just as worthy and valuable as the man. Unlike Islam, that tells us that a woman is only 1/2 the value of a man. However, the Bible does show us that there are roles to fulfill. So, in Galatians chapter 3 and verse 28, Paul tells us, the same writer, "In Christ there's neither Jew nor Greek, bond nor free, male nor female, we're all one man in Christ Jesus." That is, the blessings of the gospel are accessible to all of us on an equal basis, whether a man or a woman, boy or girl. That is accessible to all. That is not to say, however, there are not roles to fulfill in society. And that's exactly what Paul has in mind. Now let's turn attention to the family more at large here as he turns our thinking to the fathers and the children. Children, obey your parents, for this is right. Obey your parents. I think Ephesians has the wording, this is right. Obey your parents. And then we have, fathers, provoke not your children that they be not discouraged. So let's think about, first of all, the children and the fathers. We have idea that children, and the assumption is, now don't forget this assumption, don't neglect it, and that is that children are not able with their own wisdom to guide their own lives, but they must rely upon parental wisdom. So it is, children, obey your parents. This is right, and the word right, that's from Ephesians 6 and verse 1. The word right means it is right in and of itself, that there is submission of children to parents. Children are not wise enough to guide themselves. So with that in mind, how startling is it to you to know that in the public school system in many places in our country right now, such as in Washington State and in Oregon, that children can, in grade school or in junior high, and particularly in high school, they may make lifelong decisions for themselves regarding birth control, abortion, sex change operations, without the knowledge of their parents. It tells you where our society is headed. Children are not able on their own to make such decisions. And the Bible shows us, outlining for us, the role of the father in the home and the children in the home. And then fathers, we're told, the fathers, don't provoke your children that they be not discouraged. The assumption underlying this is that the primary responsibility for the direction of children falls upon fathers. Listen to what David has to say in Psalms 127, verses 3 and 4. Children are a heritage of the Lord. Blessed, and then he tells us, blessed is the man that has his quiver full of them. As arrows in the hands of a mighty man, so are the children of youth. Children are heritage of the Lord. So the idea, arrows in the hands of a mighty man, there's the father giving direction, reminding us of Abraham, giving direction to his children. So as arrows in the hands of a mighty man, so are the children of youth. Children are heritage that is a blessing from God to parents. And blessed is the man that has his quiver full of them. So the direction of children falls upon the family, but specifically, more importantly, upon the head of the household, the father. With that in mind, you might think about this for just a moment. What happens when there are no fathers in the home? What frequently happens, not necessarily every single time, but what frequently happens? Jesse Lee Peterson has been a friend of mine for a long time, and he's in Los Angeles, California, black preacher. Jesse Lee Peterson is pretty plain spoken. And he comes to black audience and he says, listen, here's what's happening. And he's been here and talked to us about some of these things. He said, the statistics are that in black families, 3/4, now get this, 3/4 of the children are born without fathers in the home, 3/4. In Hispanic families, we have 50%, and in the Caucasian, 30%. So it shows you where some of the turmoil takes place as we see it in society working out. What has happened? What has happened? The government has taken over the role of the father in the home. And when the father is displaced, then we don't have real good direction frequently is the case. So that's the model that is given to us. Now, everybody, of course, recognizes that we've had all of us making mistakes in life. We want to correct and adjust those mistakes. And God willing, we all try to do that very thing. But that's the model that God gives us to give us stability in society. So that's how we have it lined out with not only marriages, but also families as well. Now, I want you to watch this for just a few moments. And this is the last point that I want to make, and that is the war against the family that we see in America. There is a huge war. Now, I laid out those principles for us that we have in Colossians 3. That is, Paul laid them out, simply reiterated them. But let's think about the war against the family. So from the founding period, we don't have anything, it's interesting, regarding the family in the Declaration of Independence or in the Constitution. Why is that? Our founders recognized, one and all, that we were centered upon a God-oriented worldview, a biblical orientation. So they didn't mention it, they didn't feel the need to mention these things in the Constitution. Here's one of the statements, and I want you to watch what he has to say. This is from Dr. Alan Carlson from the Rockford Institute regarding this specific point. The founders understood the family to be the social unit that reconciled liberty with order, and that kept the individual's interest in balance with the interest of community and posterity. Now, what does that mean? What does all that wording and verbiage mean? It means that we have liberty in a nation, but it is liberty that is orderly. And the order that comes in our liberty is a byproduct of families. Father, mother, children. Children in obedience to parents. That's the order that is given to us. So that's what he means by reconciled liberty with order. And when this is disturbed, then our society itself becomes disturbed and in chaotic form, doesn't it? So that's what he has in mind here. So we need to keep our individual's interest in balance with the interest of community and posterity. That is, we want a godly home. And a godly home will keep society itself in track. Here's another comment, continuing his statement. the founders made parents the instruments in that is God's great design, and laid on children the perpetual obligation of honoring their parents. And from this obligation, no state can absolve children. All right, what is the point here? Now, whether you're a single parent or not, the point is the same. The obligation is children to parents. And no state can supplant that and remove the obligation that a child has to parents. And that's the divine order. With that in mind, I want you to think about how we're going in our nation. I could have put anybody's picture up there. It doesn't matter. People say, well, you got Joe Biden. This is a statement because he made it so plainly just last year. There are a lot of Republicans' picture I could have put up here as well, so I'll say that. Now, this is what he made in a comment to Teachers of the Year in the assembly. He said, they're all our children. And the reason you're the Teachers of the Year is because you recognize that. They're not somebody else's children. They're like yours when they're in the classroom. There's no such thing as someone else's child. Then he repeats it, there's no such thing as someone else's child. Our nation's children are all our children. Now let's think about the basic principle or the basic understanding upon which he's operating here. All our children, they belong to all of us? Is that what he's saying? Yes, indeed. Bill Nye, for example, he's that science guy, isn't he? The science guy. Bill Nye said, parents have no right to teach their children creationism in the home. No right. Think about that. Here's what Melissa Harris Perry, who's a commentator at MSNBC, said. We have to break through our kind of private idea that kids belong to their parents or kids belong to the families and recognize that kids belong to whole communities. What's happening? Don't you feel the ground shifting beneath your feet right here? We don't have the model that God has given us. That is, as arrows in the hands of a mighty man, so are the children of youth. Fathers responsible for the direction of the family. Mothers responsible for teaching their children, Titus chapter 3. Women are to teach their children at home. We don't have that now. They belong to the community. Here we have the question I'm asking. So think about this, backing up from what we see as far as going on in the political world. I'm asking the question, a public school, is it an auxiliary of the home or is it an auxiliary of the government? Which is it? Which is it really? Should it be, I should say. What should it be? Is it an auxiliary assisting parents in the rearing of their children and the education of the children, or is it an auxiliary of government? Obviously, from the Bible, it is an auxiliary of the home because it is the fathers and mothers that are responsible for the education of the children. But what has happened? What has happened in our country is a major shift away from that into the government schools, and that's what they are now, believes that the school system is an auxiliary of the government. And that has a lot of implications, as we're about to see. So watch what happens. We're going to go to the state of Colorado. Anybody know about the state of Colorado? 1996. So the parents in the 90s now, this is many years ago, were concerned about the direction of what was being taught in the schools, and so they came up with what was called the Parental Rights Amendment. They were going to put it into state law. You may remember this one. I don't know if the Parental Rights Amendment. And here's basically what it said, that parents have the primary responsibility to direct, control the upbringing, education, values, disciplines of our children. Now, does anyone see anything wrong with that statement? From a biblical perspective, is there anything wrong? No, not only is there nothing wrong, that is entirely a God-oriented worldview. And they wanted to put that into state law. What happened? Well, you had liberal organizations such as People of the American Way and other homosexual organizations coming to the fore saying, you're trying to stunt the education of children, and we're not going to let you stunt the education of children. And they defeated in Colorado the Parental Rights Amendment. Parents do not have the primary responsibility to direct, control the upbringing, education, values, and disciplines of their children. That's what the state of Colorado said in 1996. Parents do not have that right. Well, whose responsibility has it become? Government. Governments. It's not just Colorado. Let's move over to the state of Virginia. Senator Joseph Garland, a Democrat there in the state of Virginia, made a similar kind of a statement pertaining to the Parental Rights Amendment that was proposed for the state of Virginia in the late 1990s, copying Colorado's effort. And he said, whoa, wait a minute. We can't do this, and it was defeated there. But as a spokesman for the defeating group, he said, that would throw into society, or a tailspin, society's reasonable efforts to protect against abuse and neglect. Sometimes it's always good to stop, back up, take a breath. All right, what is he assuming here? What is the assumption? What is the groundwork upon which he is operating his thoughts? It is that the danger to the children is the home, and the protective custody belongs to the state. Now that's what they say. That's exactly the idea here. This is not to deny that wrongs have been done in homes, but it is to say that the government's role is the protective custody, and the real danger comes about from parents overseeing children. That's why Bill Nye will say, you don't have a right to teach creationism in the home. This is a war for the family, and it's a war against the family. That's what's happening in our country right now. So let's move to this one. Hillary Clinton wrote a book called It Takes a Village. Now, many people say, well, it helps to have a village of, parents and grandparents and aunts and uncles. That's not what she has in mind when she speaks about a village. She tells you very plainly what village she has in mind when she spoke several years ago, 1997, in San Francisco. This was called the Second World Congress on Family Law and Rights of the Children and Youth. Listen carefully to how she puts it. Government can help ensure that children have a healthy start in life, a solid education, and skills they need to compete in a global economy. It's also the government's task to give parents the tools they need to be good parents. All right, let's think about this for a moment. Go back to that model that I had, the schoolhouse, and when we have the family and the parents, is the school and education an auxiliary of parents, or is it an auxiliary of the government? The view plainly told here is that it is the government's school, and parents don't have a right to do anything in the schoolhouse. And we'll see more about that in just a second. That's exactly the view. And so the idea is that the overarching umbrella is the government, and it's the government school, and it's the government's responsibility to take care of your child. Now, they don't want simply to take care of your child. They want to educate your child in a global system and, of course, in a Marxist worldview. That's what they want to do. That's why every commentator that speaks on this from a liberal spectrum speaks about it as removing creationism, not just Bill Nye, removing creationism. We don't even have creationism in schools today at all. And if you have a Bible in the public school classroom, you are in trouble. You're in trouble. So, think about this final one. This is 2005, the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals, speaking about schools, and here's what they said. Listen to this. Your fundamental parental right does not extend beyond the threshold of the school door. Doesn't extend that way. They're not your children. They're government's children. I'm asking you this question: which model has been followed in our nation? The model that was given in the Bible, or the model that is given by Friedrich Engels, Spargo and Arner, the elements of socialism, in which they're government schools, government herders, government caretakers, and you are just temporary overseers of the child, but it is the government that is to oversee them. Which model are we following here? Well, it's very plain what's happening here. This is all said not simply to frighten us, even though it should, but to recognize the fact that the real fabric of society that keeps us intact is a nuclear family. It gives us order in that liberty. As Dr. Carlson had put it, it gives us ordered liberty. And it enables parents to pass on the moral values to their children. But that is exactly what they don't want any longer. That's exactly why the public schools in many places is in such chaos, because we're following a different model. I remember reading about a man by the name of William Z. Foster. William Z. Foster was the head of the Communist Party in America, and he spoke to Congress in the 1930s. Now, get the time frame, 1930s. The National Education Association was established, what was it, Carter's time, 1970s. Here's what Foster had to say. Foster said, the children are all of our children, and we need to have a national education society or an association to oversee the education of children along these lines, that socialistic lines. He wrote that in a book called Toward Soviet America. Now, what model have we been following? We established the NEA in Carter's period. We took it all to Washington, D.C. And now, to fight this, you're fighting Washington, D.C. That's exactly what we've done. So let's think about the model that the Bible gives us, redouble our efforts in training our children in the way that they should go, that when they're old, they will not depart from it. The model that the Bible gives us is mom, dad, and the kids. And we need the children to learn to respect the parents, mothers, fathers, and be trained in the way they should go, that when they're old, they'll not depart from it. In spite of the fact that we are in a war for the family in our nation. So Colossians has only 2 more lessons as far as I've planned. We're going to look at slavery next week. What does the Bible say about slavery? Colossians 3, and that begins in verse, 22. And then we'll look at the final admonition, Colossians chapter 4, verses 2 through 6, that we're to do on a daily basis in prayer and supplication to God. The lesson is yours. If you want to respond to the invitation right now, we can help you in any way we can. Come while we stand and sing.